Welcome to History Unveiled, the podcast where I tell you about extraordinary lives, flamboyant personalities forgotten or misunderstood, who nevertheless shaped history. Today, I'm opening with you the first volume of the epic novel in my book, Marguerite Brunet before Montansier, From Childhood to the Colonies. This book reveals her fabulous destiny, the one she forged for herself over 90 years, amidst a tumultuous French history. She lived through the reigns of Louis XV and then Louis XVI, rubbed shoulders with Marie Antoinette, survived the French Revolution despite being arrested for complicity with the enemy and treason, and then met Napoleon I, whom, according to some sources, she could have married. If Talleyrand had been a woman, she would have been his embodiment, a businesswoman who rose from humble beginnings. She became a multi-millionaire and obtained the royal privilege of managing the theaters of France, a position previously reserved for men. But the 18th century was full of surprises, granting women far greater importance and freedom of action than one might imagine. Marguerite wanted to seize this opportunity, and she did so through sheer hard work. A notorious gambler, she was above all a free spirit as an art historian passionate about French heritage. I had the pleasure of discovering this fascinating and modern figure. We will see her impact on the world during the Age of Enlightenment, a world undergoing profound social transformation and questioning its very foundations. Follow me on this adventure that will take you to the streets of Bayon, Paris, Versailles, and the Caribbean islands. It's a true story, and I'll explain how I brought it to life. The book will allow you to delve into the heart of this incredible adventure. But in the meantime, listen to me. The story begins in 1743 in Bayon, in the southwest of France, in Occitanie. Marguerite is 13 years old and grows up in a rather happy environment. Bayon is a vibrant border town, proud and cosmopolitan in its own way. Nestled between the Adour and Nive rivers, it lives to the rhythm of these two waterways, its true economic and cultural arteries. The port is its lifeblood. Wine, ham, wood, chocolate, furs, its life on the water that sustains the population, what we call maritime trade. Barges ply the Adour River towards the Atlantic. Merchant ships set sail for the colonies, and the quays hum with a multitude of languages: Gascon, French, Basque, sometimes Spanish, and even the occasional passing Englishman. The city is prosperous, but full of contrasts. A merchant class grows wealthy through trade, while the working classes eke out a living through crafts. Dockwork or small jobs. It is clear that, in the midst of its artistic and cultural flourishing, the Bayon way of life blends religious fervor, festive sociability, and Epicurean sensibilities. People go out, chat, drink, and sing. As for the city's architecture, like many other French cities, it is equipped with bastions, a legacy of the great architect of King Louis XIV, you'll have guessed it. I'm talking about Vauban. Bayon is also adorned with colorful half-timber-bird facades that line its lively streets. Naturally, convents and churches mark the rhythm of the hours, and one knows how to pray there as much as laughter. Bayon is not a court city, even though it witnessed the arrival of the Queen of Spain. Widowed and childless, deposed for this reason by the Sun King, it is a city of character. In any case, a city where destinies are never straightforward, especially when one is born a woman, poor, and curious about the world. To write my book, I relied on several sources, some of which contradict each other or don't always express the same truths. For example, one police officer describes her as rather ungrateful and stupid, while other sources describe her as charismatic, well-educated, and intelligent. I think the outcome of these investigations tipped the scales in favor of certain sources. I, therefore, deliberately chose certain accounts over others, studying the historical context and remaining wary of Marguerite's own diary, which should be read but taken with a grain of salt. We know that she greatly altered and embellished certain episodes of her life to erase the traces of an unremarkable childhood. She understood perfectly well that to be taken seriously in Paris, she would have to put on an act. But if I may, this charade never tarnished her core personality. I would say rather that, Driven by an instinct for survival, she adapted to the society around her and its imposed laws. However, we see on numerous occasions that she was not conformist, and that she resisted in her own way. Particularly during the Revolution, until all hope of saving the Queen was abandoned and she risked being beheaded. She will be accused of complicity and homosexual depravity, and imprisoned in the Conciergerie, where she will manage to defend herself and even recover large sums of money she had invested. She is a truly fascinating character, who manages to navigate through several regimes, much like Talleyrand did as a man and by virtue of his position. Asterisk. Chapter 1 depicts our heroine atop a tower of St. Mary's Cathedral, dreaming as any young girl her age might. I chose this image of her youth, reading her fantastical future from the summit of her personal mountain, from where she can glimpse the world, which she understands only with her hopeful eyes. What we know for certain is that she has been a student at the Ursuline convent for several years. To describe her childhood, I had to fictionalize many passages while relying on sources that described her family. Her father, Joseph Brunet, a pin maker as stated on his baptismal certificate, but listed elsewhere as a blacksmith. He was a widower when he married Marguerite's mother, Marie Capdeville, who was also widowed from a previous marriage but childless. Marguerite was born in 1730, 8 years later from this late marriage. 3 sons were born from her father's first marriage, meaning Marguerite had 3 half-brothers, 2 of whom apparently appear to have died. I imagine that only her half-brother Jean, who had joined a privateer ship serving King Louis XV, could have disappeared at sea, since he never reappears in Marguerite's story later. In this historical context, it allowed me to lay the groundwork for the kidnappings and massacres at sea perpetrated by the Barbary corsairs. In other words, the Muslim pirates from Algiers, Tunis, and Morocco or Tripoli, who roamed the Mediterranean, sank European ships, and took hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children into slavery. Just to clarify, for every man abducted, 2 others were left for dead. Europe was therefore facing serious problems, and life was very uncertain when embarking on a ship. This era, barbaric at sea and bloody on land with wars of succession and territorial conflict, gives us a somewhat chaotic idea of life at that time. And yet, Bayon lived in joy. Just like the capital, the Kingdom of France was born of internal struggles and religious wars. It had been colonized by Caesar, then built upon the remnants of that colonization. It had had to defend itself, fight against plagues that decimated a third of its population in the Middle Ages, and in turn it colonized others. Under Louis XV, trade compensated for the expenses of the incessant wars that decimated its male population. Marguerite thus grew up in a France where people worked and died easily, but where the joy of living was undeniable. And she will weather all storms, living to 90, remaining free of venereal diseases and experiencing some truly unusual adventures. To return to my book, I developed the character of this young woman based on source material, and with my novelist's eye, striving to remain as faithful as possible to the facts, while connecting them together, like completing a puzzle with missing pieces. As an art and archaeological historian, I also endeavor to contextualize the aesthetics of that era and her social circle. Since Marguerite will travel to the court of Versailles and associate with Madame du Barry, and later with Queen Marie Antoinette. Chapters 2 and 3 recount an anecdote about Marguerite's encounter with a marquis, at whose home she spends a night after a carriage accident. This allowed me to insert historical flashbacks to Marguerite's early childhood, where she recalls the balls at which her mother served as a maid and where she witnesses the magnificence of the court of the Queen of Spain, which I mentioned earlier. This imaginary marquis will be her first vision of the ideal man. Gallant, polite, kind, and generous, a vision that will remain with her throughout her life like a dream. She also learns that she must leave the convent because she is 14 years old, and that her brother has disappeared at sea. She is devastated and rebels, but her mother and godmother decide to send her to Bordeaux to a millinery workshop where she will work 12 hours a day in exchange for room and board, thus showing her the reality of life. Then comes the story of her first rape. nowhere described historically. It seemed inevitable to me given the character and the libertine era. In her diary, she twice recounts her encounters with men in a way that seems too good to be true, and even quite implausible. I imagine that these two accounts, found in one of the few sources that relate Marguerite's life, were actually experienced in a rather violent way, but that Marguerite then deliberately embellished them to her advantage. It's a completely arbitrary choice by the novelist, but one that seemed much more plausible to me. I'll explain it in detail later. Rape, in any case, didn't exist at that time. Well, it only concerned a woman's virginity and the possibility of pregnancy, but rarely the consequences for her mental state. So, raped by a merchant who lied to her about a situation near Dax, she flees and, alone by the roadside, she vows never to be naive again or to find herself in distress. She will focus on her success to forget this episode. And she will later describe it in her diary in a completely different, idyllic, and highly improbable way. Especially considering the distance she traveled and the stakes of her agreement with the merchant. She returned to her mother's house in Bayon, where she stayed for a year to save money for her trip to Paris. We know that Marie then decided to send her daughter to her younger sister Hyacinth, who had been so successful in Paris. In reality, she had become a kind of madam in Paris, but no one in Bayonne knew it. It was precisely to prevent Marguerite from turning to prostitution that her mother and godmother wanted to send her as far away as possible from the brothel that was a little too close to their house in Bayonne. And it is there that everything will change for the young girl. In the next podcast, I'll read excerpts from my book, and we'll discover how Marguerite reacted and, above all, what choices she made. We'll see her life in Paris for a few years before she embarked for Martinique in the Caribbean, in the arms of her new lover, the future intendant of the island. ***. See you soon for the next episode.